So today, June 19th, Juneteenth, day celebrating the freedom that the slaves experienced. January 1st, 1863 was the date the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, but it took 2.5 years for the good news of freedom to be declared and really announced and experienced in Galveston, Texas. So it was June 19th, 1865. Union General Gordon Granger announced freedom in Galveston, Texas. And Texas was the most remote of the slave states. It had a low Union presence. So what we have is this interesting time frame where officially the Emancipation Proclamation is signed, and so officially throughout the whole Union that was preserved, freedom is the reality. That is the official declared. This is what's real, and yet the actual lived experience of slaves in Texas was the exact opposite. And I think it's a very interesting and sort of powerful and tragic vision of what we in the church refer to as the now and the not yet kingdom of God here on earth as it is in heaven. That there is that Jesus has this sort of death and resurrection on the cross that offers universal salvation and forgiveness and reconciliation to the entire world for those who would long to receive that gift, and that those who have received that gift and have been forgiven and reconciled, and in the process of being reconciled to God, there's this freedom that's experienced, and yet that kingdom is not fully known here on this world. In this world, it's not. And just to be a part of that kingdom doesn't sort of free us from the realities of this former life of slavery. We're still filled with brokenness and sin, and but we are all forgiven, and yet we still suffer the effects of this sin in this world, both our personal sin, broader corporate sin, and there's this process that we're in of being reconciled to God and being sanctified and being, experiencing that kingdom more and more in our own lives and in this broader world that we're a part of. So I think it's just this interesting, it's an interesting holiday for us to acknowledge and celebrate in solidarity with the Black community who saw, a declaration of freedom announced, and yet it took 2.5 years for that declaration to be experienced in real life, all the way into Galveston, Texas. The text this morning is from Acts 9, verses 1 through 9. Acts 9, starting in 19, verse 19. And I think it's an interesting text for us on this day, Juneteenth. I think it was yesterday we looked at the conversion of Saul, where Saul is on the road to Damascus to perpetrate evil upon followers of Jesus, to try and oppress the people who were proclaiming Jesus as king. And Jesus meets him on the road with a blinding light, and Saul is blind for a period of time. And then, we talked about this disorienting blindness that can lead us toward an understanding of truth. And I think there's some good words for us, the white church in America. So this is Acts 9, starting with verse 19, 19b, if you will. It says, "For several days Saul, was with the disciples in Damascus, and immediately he began to proclaim Jesus in the synagogue, saying, 'He is the Son of God.' All who heard him were amazed and said, "Is not this the man who made havoc in Jerusalem among those who invoked his name? And has he not come here for the purpose of bringing them bound before the chief priests?" Saul became increasingly more powerful and confounded the Jews who lived in Damascus by proving that Jesus was the Messiah. So here we have this picture of Saul as a perpetrator of evil against the kingdom. And he encounters Jesus, he encounters that blinding light, and goes through that phase of disorienting blindness and not knowing what's happening, comes to understand the lordship of Jesus, spends time with the disciples, and then all of a sudden we see him becoming a proclaimer and a proselyte of the kingdom and saying, hey, actually, this is the truth. And he's caught up in that movement, right? In the movement of God's kingdom of freedom and liberation in Jesus. And he's caught up in that now and the not yet. And then all of a sudden he flips sides and he says, hey, this is what we need to be doing. And so I think it's an interesting vision and illustration for us to consider as we consider God's kingdom, which is now and not yet. The continued existence of racism in our world, not just in our country, is an example of the not yet. But I think part of the task of us today and in the days and the weeks and the months and the years and the decades and maybe even the centuries to come is to allow Christ to break in with his light, to blind us, just like he did with Saul, with this sort of disorienting and disrupting blindness, so that we can see with new eyes, that we can see again and start proclaiming God's truth, and God's truth that as his kingdom expands and becomes more and more widespread and universal here on this in this world, and again, his kingdom is quite simply the places in which his will is done. I think that's a simple way to understand the movement of God's kingdom. That as we see the growth of that kingdom, some of us may find ourselves like Saul, shifting from that, maybe not an active perpetration of evil upon the Black community, but shifting toward we've experienced that blindness, and now as we see truth, we're called to be proselytes and proclaimers of the freedom and love that Christ calls us to in this world. So there's a quote from, or there's a reference to a moment with Sojourner Truth in the devotional this morning, where there's this old heckler who was speaking out against Sojourner Truth. He said, "Old woman, I don't care any more for your talk than I do for the bite of a flea." And Sojourner Truth's response to this gentleman was, "The Lord willing, I'll keep you scratching." So my hope is that we can continue as we live in this now and not yet kingdom, that the not yet moments and not yet pockets of this world will keep us scratching as we seek to further declare and embody and share God's good news of his advancing kingdom, both in this world and the next.